First of all, we should bear in mind that we don't have a capitalist system. No capitalist system has ever survived. It would self-destruct in 5 minutes. So what we have is a kind of state capitalist system, with the state playing a substantial role in American history, a very substantial role in economic development, in production, and research and development, a lot of other bailouts, lots of other devices to keep the private sector viable. So it's a kind of a state capitalist system, like others. They vary a little on how they do it. So is there an alternative to this? Of course. For example, the alternative that was taken for granted by 19th century workers before it was sort of beaten out of people's heads by massive propaganda. But you go back to the early Industrial Revolution, which was right around here, eastern Massachusetts. It was the period, probably the freest press ever in the United States. There were lots and lots of newspapers representing different ethnic groups, class workers, all sorts of people. And there was a lot of participation, direct participation, very lively press, widely read, and so on. And if you look at the working class press, they were expressing the common view of working people, namely that those who work in the mills should own them and run them. Yeah, that's very natural. And as I say, we've come close to that a number of times, terrifying to private owners. You can't have meaningful political democracy without functioning economic democracy. And I think this is, at some level, understood by working people. It has to be brought to awareness and consciousness, but it's just below the surface. And in fact, things are happening. So some of the most interesting are around in Ohio, around the Cleveland area, Cleveland Project. There's a dozen, maybe hundreds of not huge, but significant enterprises that are worker-owned, worker-managed. In some places there are, the biggest worker-owned collection of conglomerate is Mondragon in the Basque Country. That's worker-owned, but not worker-managed. And it's, industries, banks, schools, communities, very broad configuration. And there are various other elements of it here and there. A couple of quite good books have just come out about it. One by Gar Alperovitz, America Beyond Capitalism, which is about the worker-owned enterprises that are sprouting around the country. And this could go much beyond. And in fact, I think we can also go back to the days of that were beginning in the 1930s of takeover of industrial production. And there are cases of it. There are cases which have come pretty close to workers taking over, workers and communities taking over industry and producing things that can be needed. And that, if there was enough public support, that could have been done in the last few years. So for example, when Obama took over the auto industry, it was basically nationalized. And there were a couple of paths that could have been followed. One path was the one that was followed. Reconstitute it, give it back to essentially the same, banks, management, and so on, a couple of different names. That was one way. The public paid for that. An alternative was to hand it over to communities and the workforce and have them turn to producing things that the country very badly needs, like, say, high-speed rail. Skilled workers in the Rust Belt have the capacity, with a little help, to do that, and the country badly needs it, and they need the jobs, and that rebuilds a popular movement which can be, again, on the forefront of change. These are possibilities, and across the board there's any number of things we can do. So I don't think there's any shortage of opportunities. There's a shortage of dedication to making use of those opportunities. Sit-down strikes, which began at a significant level in the 1930s, were very threatening to management and ownership, because a sit-down strike is one step before taking over the factory and having the workers taking over the factory and running it and kicking out the managers, and probably doing a better job. Democratic control of institutions, whether they're communities or workplaces or any others, alliances among them, federal arrangements. These are all perfectly feasible alternatives. There's no economic or political theory that tells us there's anything wrong with them. They conflict with the structure of existing power systems, and therefore the educational and cultural system tries to drive them out of your minds and make them seem insane or crazy or unthinkable. But there's nothing unthinkable about them, and you can move towards realizing them. In fact, even in the United States, where you get no major discussion of these things, there are probably thousands of self-managed enterprises, not huge ones, but lots of them, and they're growing. And they could, as I mentioned, they could reach the scale of, say, producing the green technology, high-speed rail and so on, that the country badly needs. It's not a law of nature that we have to import solar technology from China, a poor developing country, or that we have to get high-speed rail facilities from Spain. Those aren't laws of nature. Those are political decisions, social, economic, and political decisions. They can be made differently. If they're made differently enough, we'll be moving towards a kind of an anarchist type society.